All right, welcome. This is part 2 in our lecture related to early Italian Renaissance painting. We're going to be looking at another fresco painting. This is located in a convent for women, so it was not seen by outsiders very often. It's a scene depicting the Last Supper, which we all know is the final meal that Jesus shared with his apostles before his crucifixion. The artist is Andrea del Castagno, and again, this isn't one of your official lists of works on the 250 major AP list, art history list, but it is important. It's a good comparison piece because we are going to be looking at Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, and so it's really important that we look at this earlier representation of the Last Supper because Leonardo da Vinci does some major changes. So even though it's not officially one that you have to ID, you really should know this work well, and really in order to look at and compare to other Last Supper scenes, which we will be looking at in the future. Hopefully one of the things that you notice right off is the use of linear perspective. The space looks very illusionistic. So Andrea del Castagno is incorporating that concept. Judas is depicted away from the other apostles. So we have the apostles sitting on one side of the table, and then Judas is sort of isolated and sits on the other side. This was the typical arrangement of Last Supper paintings until Leonardo da Vinci's version. This is a closer look at it. We are going to be looking at some of the figures in more detail. Here we see the figure of John the Evangelist. Let me see if I have a close-up one. There we go. And he's often, when you see these Last Supper scenes, John is often depicted as very young and sleepy. Here we see that the figure of Judas is portrayed in a very strict profile, which isn't very flattering. The way compared to St. John, whose posture is very innocent and slumber. And so we have this sort of contrast of, maybe this sort of innocence compared with this sort of treachery and sort of evil that Judas represents because of his betrayal to Jesus. Something else interesting to note is that the apostles that are sort of, divided on either side of the table, if you really look closely, they sort of mimic the same hand gestures, and so the painting becomes symmetrical from that point of view. So the apostles are sort of mirroring each other. The colors of the apostles' robes and their postures really do help to contribute to the balance of the piece. And so again, this really goes back, hopefully you're thinking of Giotto and the earlier work that we saw of Masaccio, and in particular the Holy Trinity. One of the things that we look at, too, is that there's a departure that Del Castagno has made from earlier artistic styles in which there's a sense of naturalism and attention to detail, especially when we look at these panels of marble. Again, this could be referencing that idea of Roman panel painting that we looked at when we were studying the work of ancient Rome, again signaling the shift towards a more classical approach. The highly detailed marble, again, does sort of harken back to that Roman first style of wall painting that we talked about, where they sort of painted and tried to make the wall look like marble. It wasn't made of real marble. Furthermore, some other things to note, the use of color highlights particular features of the figure. People have different colored hair, and it's sort of, different hairstyles. So again, that notion of historical specificity. There's these sort of flowing robes, again, that seem to show that there is a body underneath. And so this idea of wet drapery or these figures, mimicking Greek and Roman sculpture. The foreshortened halos are also represented. So again, that use of combining sort of Christian symbols and sort of pretending how they would act in the real world is an interesting fusion of science and Christianity. And again, these sort of foreshortened halos are going to foreshadow advancements to come that we'll see in later depictions of religious narratives. So this is a good, again, a comparison piece, because this will be very helpful when we do look at the high Renaissance period, and we look at the work of Leonardo da Vinci and his Last Supper. We're going to be looking at some paintings, not frescoes. These aren't mural paintings that we've seen in churches. This is an image done by Fra Filippo Lippi. It is Madonna and Child with two angels. It was painted around 1465, and it is one of his best known and admired works. And it really is a very admired painting of the Renaissance in general. I think because there's a really interesting sort of love story behind the painting. The life of Filippo Lippi, who was a monk, does make for an interesting tale. He was not exactly devoted to his religious duties and fell in love with a nun named Lucrezia. His love was returned by the nun, and after years of a passionate secretive affair, they both were forced to renounce their religious vows. The two did go on to have children, a son and daughter. The son, Filippino, would become a brilliant painter, following in the steps of his father. And I think the popularity of this work comes from the fact that, the semblance of the Madonna that's being represented, some people think it might actually be a portrait of Lucrezia herself. This depiction of the Virgin Mary is unusual for the time. She's depicted in profile. She's praying in front of the child, the little baby Jesus, who's being supported by two angels. And if you look, they look like real people. They don't look like these sort of flat, stiff, rigid figures from the medieval period. They look very much like, women and children that would probably be seen in the streets of Florence. The two angels look like little boys, little rascals that might get into trouble. Behind, and it's also interesting too, because there's this window frame being depicted. And then, outside of that frame is this beautiful landscape that is inspired by Flemish paintings. This is one of the official 250 works that you do need to be able to ID. So I think people admire this work too, because there's a sort of sweetness of the composition. People also, I think, are very drawn to the great beauty and elegance of how the Madonna figure is represented. She has these really graceful, translucent veils. And this sort of woman's hairdressing would later become a model of elegance for many painters, such as Botticelli, who we're going to be looking at next. And in fact, Botticelli was a pupil of Fra Filippo. And so what this signals is that this painting is done from a more humanist approach. Again, what I mentioned earlier is that, people are interested in Christian themes and ideas, but they're also, interested in the fact that they do have these secular earthly lives here, and are interested in having, understanding that part of their life and not just thinking about the afterlife and sort of, how they see themselves in the universe and the world. And so again, there's this sort of realism and naturalism. Again, a very beautiful, real-looking woman and, very realistic baby and children. The baby Jesus, is chubby and, he looks like a real baby. Again, we see advancements with the halo, being foreshortened. And now it's not even a disc. It's more of just a simple outline. Eventually, the halo will disappear in later representations of religious figures and religious narratives. And so, again, this is sort of foreshadowing some of those changes. The painting does contain religious symbols. There are rocks and the seashore outside of the window that they're placed in front of. These are recurrent themes in Florentine Renaissance painting. The seashore probably alludes to the Virgin Mary's title as Star of the Sea and Port of our Salvation, and the rock alludes to different tales of the prophet Daniel. And something else to note is that the landscape is rendered in atmospheric perspective. That's a vocabulary term that you had, where it's a sense of illusionism, where when we look at, out into the distance, things seem to become fuzzy and recede and less defined. And so he's depicting that, and again, giving this realistic sense of illusionistic space. So, compare and contrast this image of the Madonna by Felipe with this earlier Byzantine image that we did talk about, Virgin and Child with Saints and Angels. And these two are required on the major AP 250 list. And definitely I could see the AP College Board, having you compare and contrast these two images. Definitely in terms of stylistic conventions. So take a moment and think about that. Some things that should stick out is obviously this contrast of naturalism versus this sort of conceptual view of the figures. Remember, with early Christian and Byzantine art, they weren't interested in imitating nature. And so the figures are flat, linear, they're sort of floating, usually against a gold background. Very formal, very rigid. And the figures they seem like they're in another world or another sort of, it doesn't seem earthly. Here, you have the halos, the sort of flat, circular behind the heads. These kind of weird, elongated faces that was very typical of the Byzantine era with the almond-shaped eyes. The little baby kind of looks strange. It doesn't really look like a natural, chubby little baby. And here, definitely there's the sense of realism, the use of illusionistic, perspective. And, the figures are anatomically correct and, seem to have volume. And also, there's definitely a sense of intimacy, I think, between the mother and child. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. It definitely does seem like, a mother and child, as opposed, to this being so formal. So, think about that, and when you're going back and studying for the midterm that we're going to have soon, think about, comparing and contrasting certain works of art, or if you can think of, there, in this time period, there was a work that represented, the Madonna, and, just think about comparing and contrasting images and making connections or cross-connections. Our next work or painting that we're going to be looking at is by Sandro Botticelli, The Birth of Venus. This is a very iconic painting. I'm sure you've seen it before. Both of these paintings were done with, and the one we looked at before of Madonna and Child were done with a medium called tempera paint, which was a mixture of sort of egg and pigment. And so this is what, smaller sort of paintings, not fresco mural paintings, would have used this technique. When we go to the Northern Renaissance, they'll use oil painting. His real name was Alessandro de Marino di Vanni Filippi. but he became known as Sandro Botticelli. He was an Italian painter of the early Renaissance. He belonged to the Florentine school under the patronage of the Medici family, in particular Lorenzo de' Medici. He's well known for his earlier work because of his use of mythology as the subject. It's important, though, that you don't think of this as a pagan image, even though it's depicting the goddess Venus. What he's referencing, or what he was into, was a philosophy known as Neo-Platonism, which was attempting to reconcile Platonic ideals. These are sort of philosophies associated with the philosopher Plato with Christianity. It was sort of a popular philosophy at the time. And so in this context, we might look at the Venus, or she can be seen more as an allegory for the Virgin Mary. This painting, compared to the other paintings that we've looked at so far from the early Italian Renaissance period, is a lot different. It's almost the antithesis of the other trends that we have talked about earlier in Italian painting. The bodies lack a feeling of solidity and weight. When we look at these figures, they do seem sort of floaty. They do have mass and volume, but when we look closely at the figure of Venus, she's standing in what looks like contrapposto, but it's not quite contrapposto. She's sort of balancing on one foot, and even though she has a very voluptuous figure, it's almost like she doesn't have any sort of structure or skeleton. It's almost sort of rubbery, and and so in that sense, it's not anatomically correct. So while these bodies do lack the sort of solidity and weight that we've seen with earlier painters such as Masaccio, and they are very idealized and voluptuous. There's also little illusion of depth. So if we look closely too, everything is happening in the foreground. And then in the background, we have these sort of pattern trees acting as like a screen behind the figures. These little waves, these are supposed to be sort of ripples or waves in the ocean, are very stylized. And then the flowers, the falling flowers. Let me see if I can zoom in. Let's zoom in a little bit, yeah. So, when we look, yeah, here you get a better idea. See how she's sort of standing, and, this isn't possible. But look at these stylized waves and flowers. So they're very much stylized in this sort of patterning. Again, sort of the antithesis of what we think about with early Renaissance painting. There's no use of atmospheric perspective or linear perspective. And again, there's an emphasis on, surface painting, surface detail. Again, this sort of, these lovely patterns, and this sort of extreme linear style. This is actually something that we'll see in North Renaissance painting when we get to that unit. So the theme depicted here comes from literature, and so also during the Renaissance we'll see cross currents happening between literature and the visual arts. It comes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And Venus is portrayed naked on a shell on the seashore. So she's sort of portrayed on this scallop shell. And on the left are the winds blowing gently. These are known as zephyrs. These were, again, these sort of mythological Greek figures. And so they're blowing or creating a breeze that sort of is caressing and blowing her hair. And also this sort of shower of flowers as well around her. On her right is a handmaid who waits for her, and when she comes to the shore, she'll wrap her in this beautifully, this real pretty patterned fabric. The meadow is sprinkled with violets, which is a symbol of modesty, and again, this is a symbol that is often associated with the Virgin Mary, but it also was used in love potions as well. Another literature or reference to literature is also the stanzas, which were by a famous poet named Angelo Poliziano, who was a contemporary of Botticelli. So again, artists and writers were hanging out together and exchanging ideas, and so we can definitely see these references to literature. And he was Poliziano, I think that's how I mispronounced his name, was a Neoplatonic poet of the Medici court. So I have examples of a pose called the Venus Pudica, or this sort of image of the Venus covering her genital parts. We've seen this before. This is an early Greek Hellenistic statue of the goddess Venus. We talked about this in the sense that she is represented more as a real woman taking a bath than a goddess. But again, this was one of the first female nudes ever depicted, and the sense of anatomy, voluptuousness, the contrapposto, and so this pose of the Venus, standing with her hand and in front of her to cover herself. We saw this earlier with this depiction by Masaccio in The Expulsion of Adam and Eve, and here we see it with Botticelli's depiction of Venus. And so this was a classical theme, and it's called Venus Pudica, Pudica. And so the work, and from a Neoplatonical sense, would mean that the birth, this idea of the birth of love and the spiritual beauty are linked together and are driving forces of life. Some art historians also believe that Botticelli was also looking at Greek vase painting. So if we look here, this is one of the Greek vase paintings that we studied. We notice that the figures are isolated against the ground, and so when you look at Botticelli's picture, it sort of has that sort of sense where you have these sort of groupings and isolated figures against a flat background. Again, because he isn't using linear perspective, and he's using more using more stylistic approaches in terms of his space. And so this painting is very much about physical beauty. I think when you look at the painting, it's very sensual and very erotic. And again, it's this idea that through the contemplation of physical beauty, we can arrive at divine beauty. So remember, we are going to be getting to know the artist that painted and sculpted and built buildings in a more intimate way. So in the 1940s, Botticelli was really influenced by a radical religious reformer, friar named San Vanrala. I know I said that wrong. Who gained a large following in Florence, and he was attacking the cult of paganism in the city. This sort of looking back towards pagan culture or classical culture, and he became very popular for a while. So much so that the Medici family actually fled the city, and he was able to take control of the city. His followers gathered pieces of what they considered pagan art, and burned them in public bonfires. Botticelli seems to have been deeply influenced by this friar, and he may have burned many of his own works, referring to classical mythology. after his death, Savonarola, I'll spell it Savanarola, he was burned and had a trial by death by burning at the stake in 1498. Botticelli painted only traditional religious scenes and apparently stopped painting after the 1500s. So that marks the end of our segment on early Italian Renaissance painting. Our next segment will deal with early Italian Renaissance sculpture and architecture.